He hadn't touched a woman in 20 years. Not a handshake, not even a hug. The world called him cold, untouchable, but no one knew the real reason why. His name was Ethan Carter, one of America's most powerful CEOs, a man who lived alone in a glass tower overlooking the endless lights of Manhattan. Every morning, he'd vanish before sunrise, drowning himself in a sea of meetings, numbers, and suffocating silence. His sprawling mansion echoed at night, not with music or laughter, but with the haunting sound of emptiness. People whispered that he had everything: wealth beyond measure, influence that could bend the world to his will, and a power that few could ever dream of. But if you looked closer, truly looked past the designer suits and the stoic expression, you could see it. A profound sadness that never left his eyes. A ghost from a lifetime ago. 20 years earlier, on a dark, rain-slicked night, he had lost his fiancée in a tragic car accident. Since that moment, he had methodically built walls around his heart, walls so high and so cold that no one ever dared to climb them. But one frigid morning in November, fate decided to test those walls. Ethan found himself stopping by a small diner near his office, a place he had never noticed before, a tiny haven tucked between towering skyscrapers. He only went in because his driver had parked nearby and he needed a quick coffee before a grueling board meeting. The bell over the door jingled softly as he stepped inside, a sound that seemed to belong to another, simpler world. The air was thick with the comforting smell of pancakes and freshly brewed coffee. Behind the counter stood a young woman, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her hands busy wiping a table, while a small toddler played quietly with a box of crayons in a corner booth. "Good morning," she said, her voice tired but her smile genuine. "What can I get for you?" Her voice was warm, too warm for that freezing morning. Ethan looked up from his phone, momentarily pulled from his world of stock prices and quarterly reports. "Just coffee, black." She nodded, pouring it with a careful, practiced hand. Just then, the child giggled, waving a bright yellow crayon in the air. "Mommy, look, a sunshine." Ethan's gaze drifted over. The little boy's innocent laughter echoed in the tiny diner, and somewhere deep inside him, something long frozen, something he thought was dead, shifted just slightly. "That's beautiful," Ethan murmured, the words surprising even himself. The woman smiled shyly, a faint blush on her cheeks. "He loves drawing suns. Says they make the world happy again." Ethan sipped his coffee in silence, pretending not to listen. But every word she spoke, every small interaction, pulled him further in. He learned her name was Grace Miller, a single mother who had been running the diner alone since her parents passed away. She worked punishing double shifts just to pay rent, often surviving on only a few hours of sleep. When he finally got up to leave, Ethan placed a crisp, large bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, his voice low. She frowned, looking at the money and then back at him. "Sir, this is far too much." He looked at her then, not with the cold, commanding gaze of a CEO, but with something softer, almost uncertain. Considerate, an appreciation, for the sunshine. And for the first time in 2 decades, a genuine, albeit small, smile touched Ethan Carter's lips. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself inexplicably drawn back to that diner, again and again. He always sat at the same table, always ordered the same black coffee. Grace began to notice the quiet kindness hidden behind his distant eyes. He never said much, but he would always ask how her son was doing, or if she'd had a chance to eat lunch herself. He noticed the little things, the things no one else saw. One snowy morning, Grace was outside, struggling with heavy boxes of supplies. The sidewalk was a sheet of ice, and before she could even react, her feet slipped out from under her. She fell, the boxes scattering across the cold pavement. Just as she went down, Ethan, stepping out of his car, rushed forward. Acting on pure instinct, he caught her by the arm, steadying her. It was the first time he had touched another person in 20 years. For a split second, the world just stopped. The blare of city traffic faded into a dull hum. She looked up at him, breathless, and he froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand trembling where it held her arm. But for the first time, the touch didn't bring a wave of agonizing pain. It brought warmth. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Grace nodded, her eyes wide with surprise. I think so." He helped her to her feet, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition. Two lonely souls, each weathering their own private storm, finding a moment of shared stillness. From that day forward, Ethan's visits grew longer. Sometimes he'd arrive to find a leaky pipe under the sink and, without a word, would roll up his sleeves and fix it. Other times, he'd help carry in heavy boxes when the delivery truck arrived during a busy lunch rush. Grace tried her best to hide her exhaustion, to always greet him with a smile, but Ethan saw the dark circles under her eyes, the bruises of fatigue that makeup couldn't quite conceal. One evening, after she had finally locked up, she found a small envelope tucked under the cash register. Inside was a note, written in careful, elegant handwriting. "For repairs, and maybe a day off. Everyone deserves to rest. E." She looked around the empty diner, but he was already gone, a silent benefactor melting back into the city night. A few weeks later, disaster struck. The diner faced eviction. The landlord had sold the building to a developer, and Grace was given mere days to vacate. She fought desperately, calling lawyers, pleading for an extension, but there was nothing left to do. The next time Ethan came in, he found her in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, her face streaked with tears. His chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice strained. "I didn't want your pity," she replied, her own voice breaking. "You've already done so much for me." He hesitated, his gaze softening. Then he said, quietly but firmly, "I don't do pity, Grace. I do hope." The very next morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the diner. A team of workers stepped out, unloading brand-new furniture, cans of fresh paint, and a large, beautiful sign. It read, "Sunshine Cafe. Reopening soon." Grace stood on the sidewalk, frozen in disbelief. Ethan approached her, holding out a set of keys. "You bought it?" she whispered, fresh tears filling her eyes. He gave a slight nod. "No, I invested in the sunshine." Grace covered her mouth, a sob of overwhelming gratitude escaping her. "Why? Why would you do this for me?" Ethan looked down, his voice soft and raw with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Because 20 years ago, I lost the only person who ever made me believe in light. I thought I'd never feel that again, until I met you and your son." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his, a million questions in their depths. "Ethan." He shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise me you'll keep smiling. The world needs more of that." Months later, the Sunshine Cafe became the heart of the neighborhood, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of community. Ethan visited often, not as a reclusive billionaire, but as a friend, a man who was slowly, piece by piece, rediscovering his own humanity. One afternoon, Grace's son, his face beaming, ran up to him holding a drawing. "Mr. Ethan, look, it's you, me, and Mommy, all under the sunshine." Ethan took the piece of paper, his throat tight with emotion. "It's perfect," he whispered. Grace smiled from behind the counter, discreetly wiping a tear from her eye. "He calls you our guardian angel." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, a rare, unguarded emotion glimmering in his eyes. "Maybe you're the angels," he said softly. "You two reminded me what it means to live." That night, as he walked out of the warm, bright diner and into the quiet New York evening, snow began to fall again. The same soft, white flakes as that terrible night 20 years ago. But this time, It didn't hurt. This time, it felt like peace. And for the first time in decades, Ethan Carter, the man who refused to touch anyone, finally felt the warmth of life touching him back. Because sometimes the most broken hearts aren't healed by grand miracles, but by simple kindness, a child's laugh, and the radiant light of a single mother's smile. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more content that we hope will brighten your day. We'll see you in the next one.